Hear me? I would like to welcome to all our participants who are joining us from around the world. My name is Mara, and on the behalf of my colleagues at the Hebrew University's Division for Advancement and External Relations, I'd like to welcome you to this thrilling and groundbreaking lecture. I also would like to remind you that after the lecture, we will open the question and answer session, and you can raise your digital hand and ask for your question. I will open your microphone. If we will not have time to answer all your questions, you are welcome to send me by mail and I will forward to Professor Shafir. Before that, I would like to introduce to you a Hebrew University very close friend, Benjamin Stowe, who will introduce Professor Shafir. Benjamin is a family lawyer working in London. Benjamin studied at King's College London and Leeds University, where he gained the first-class honors in law. Benjamin has been a long-standing supporter of the Hebrew University, having studied at the Rothberg International School Summer Ulpan program. He currently sits as a trustee of the British Friends of the Hebrew University, having previously run their young professional group. He's married with one daughter, and soon he will have his second daughter, so Mazal Tov, Benjamin. And now the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, everybody. And firstly, thank you to Mara for both the introduction, but also the great honor of being allowed to speak to you all and introduce Professor Sharoni Shafir. As Mara said, the Hebrew University has a very special place in my heart. As former chair of the Young Professionals Group and now a trustee, I've had the opportunity to dedicate my time, some of my time, for the betterment of the Hebrew University and all of its wonderful projects and research facilities. Of particular note was my relatively recent visit to campus for the Special Board of Governors 100th anniversary celebrations, marking the 1918 cornerstone laying ceremony and the events of the first year of the British Mandate and the Balfour Declaration. Returning to campus for that very, very special Board of Governors, some 9 years after I studied at the Rothberg School, I witnessed the exceptional development and global impact of Israel's foremost center of advanced learning and research. To be on campus and experience what the university has to offer firsthand allows you to understand the reality of a pluralist, tolerant, open-minded student and faculty community doing good for not only Israel, but also the wider world. And with that wonderful experience still fresh in my memory, with the hope of returning to campus when the COVID-19 restrictions are lifted, I'm honored to introduce Professor Sharoni Shafir. Professor Shafir is the director of the Triwaks Bee Research Center and heads the newly established Institute of Environmental Sciences at the Robert H. Smith Faculty of Agriculture, Food and Environment. Professor Shafir obtained his PhD from Stanford University in 1995, and his scientific interests include bee biology, nutritional ecology, perception, learning, and decision-making in the use of bees for pollination. I understand that he's authored over 70 papers in peer-reviewed journals. Professor Shafir's department is in a unique position to study many of the facets of the relationships between humans and insects. As human populations grow and our environment faces many changes and challenges, the interface between humans and insects is constantly evolving. And in the new world that we're living in COVID-19, Professor Shafir's continued efforts and research will be required to arrive at solutions that will contribute to human welfare, deal with the challenges that we're facing now, whilst promoting and preserving a healthy and biologically diverse environment. Professor Shafir and his team are doing fantastic work. And with that, it is my honor to hand over to him for his talk entitled Life in the Balance, the Honeybee Perspective. Professor.
Thank you, Benjamin. Hi, world. I cannot see you, but I see there's many there. So thank you for the honor. Thank you, Ma. Thank you, Ben, for the introduction. I will delve into the mind of bee. I will share my screen. Let me do that and do the technical things. Also, so I can see. There we go. So you should be seeing my screen now?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. So it's life in the balance and trying to see it from the bee perspective. What you see here is my office. I'm sitting right there. This is the Triwaks Research Center. This is the first of the buildings of the center. You can see behind me that the wall is kind of crooked. That's these walls there. I'm sitting in what is built like a beehive. And the idea is really to sit in a hive, to think like a bee, to see the world as a bee. And that's what I'm trying to share with you today is the honeybee perspective. So as Ben was mentioning today in COVID-19, we're getting a new perspective on many things. And it's our job or as scientists really to try to see things a bit differently. And I'm doing it from a bee's perspective. And of course, today we're talking about bees because Rosh Hashanah is coming soon, and we'll soon get to that. But why am I calling it life in the balance? The idea of balance in life, generally of moderation, is an ancient idea from ancient Greece already. So it's everything in moderation. Oscar Wilde, the witty Oscar Wilde added to that, everything in moderation, including moderation. But still, this is the idea of a balance. Moderation is an old idea and still with us today. We're trying to balance our life. And I'll talk specifically about balancing nutrition and how do bees do it. Now, bees have been around for over 100 million years. So think of that scale. Humans came into the scene maybe a few million years ago. The honeybee itself, one out of some 25,000 species of bees, pretty much the way it is now, as far as we know, has been around for some 20 million years. So these bees have been flying around doing their business for millions and millions of years. And it's really the last few decades that we've changed the world so drastically, with the human population increasing, with the world changing so much, agriculture coming in. And so the whole honeybee perspective has changed. Now, what do bees need in the world? They need not to be sprayed with pesticides, and they need to have flowers. And that gets us to, of course, how is honey made? Bees collect nectar from which they evaporate the water, condense the sugars, and make honey. But if you think, why is it that we want to talk about bees when in Rosh Hashanah we tend to dip our apple in the honey? I think the common response is, well, bees make the honey for which we should be grateful for. But really, true, honey is a great, a wonderful product. Here you see a whole comb of honey. But really, the apple is what we should be thanking bees for even more. So apples, of course, come from flowers. This is an orchard of apple trees. These trees are shouting with odors and visual displays for the bees to come and visit them, to collect the nectar or the pollen. And while they do that, the bees pollinate the flower, and then the plant gets pollination services. Basically, it gets the chance to produce offspring for future. And if we look just in terms of the economics of it, the worth of the value of the pollination services provided by bees. Now, there's many wild bees also, but in agriculture, it's mostly the honeybee, is worth between 30 and 100 times more than the value of honey. So it's really that's the huge benefit of bees to humanity, is that they make our food and feed us. If we look at it in terms of numbers, in terms of the mass of what we eat, every third bite we should thank the bees. About a third of the food we eat is thanks to bees. Excuse me. Now this is both directly, like you saw the cucumber flower becoming a cucumber, the apple flower becoming an apple, the avocado flower becoming an avocado, and so forth. But also indirectly. Even when we eat milk products or meat, those cows have been fed forage, that had to be grown over huge expanses of land. It's a huge ecological cost. But you have to produce seeds to produce all this forage. And how do you make the seeds? By honeybees, other bees, pollinating these flowers to produce the seeds. So it's direct and indirect contribution. But even more than the third of the mass of what we eat, if we look at the diversity of what we eat, it's about 2/3 of the crops, of the foods, of the different foods we eat are pollinated to some degree by bees. If we look at the more developed world, Western Europe, North America, Australia, and so forth, we benefit from about 75 to 85% of the diversity of what we eat by bee pollination. It's a huge contribution. And it's not only the diversity of food, but it also happens to be a lot of the very mineral, vitamin rich, nutritionally rich foods that are bee pollinated. So many of you may have seen this quote attributed to Einstein, that if the bee disappears from the surface of the earth, man would have no more than 4 years to live. Unfortunately, this is running around the internet and many websites. You'll see it written in many places. The idea is to show you how important are bees. However, and maybe that's one take-home message from this lecture, Einstein did not say anything like this, and it's not true. I mean, we're not going to disappear in 4 years. Our life will be much poorer, also just economically, because we depend so much on bees, and bees have a hard time in the modern world, and they're becoming more and more difficult to maintain. The price of pollination services is increasing. And so, for example, almonds that are 100% dependent on bees, if some 15 years ago, the grower in California, where they produce about 80% of the almonds in the world, paid the beekeeper about $40 per hive to pollinate their almonds. From $40, today it's over $200. And so that's the price of food, the price of pollination services. And so, again, the quote is not true. If you see it, don't repeat it. And if you see it, take it with a grain of salt. But it does not mean that we do very much depend on bees and that our life will be much poorer without them. We look at the changes, I left this in Hebrew, but if we look at the world trends from 1960 to 2010, there's data. The blue here is the number of colonies, managed colonies, change in 50 years has increased by 50%. So despite all the problems we have with bees, we need them so much that beekeepers are growing them and we have more honeybee colonies than before. We have to feed so many more million people and so many more areas with bees. However, what you see in red is the requirement for pollination, the need for pollination, that has increased by 300%. Because a lot of the developing world does not want to eat potatoes and rice and beans, wants to eat fruits and vegetables and these nutritionally rich and diverse foods, and so there's a large demand. And so even though we have technology today and a lot of advancements, more and more we depend on bees today than even before. And so in a sense, you can see the honeybee as an ambassador that's linking or bringing the developing world into the nutrition of the developed world. And from this poor diet to move to this rich diet, you need more and more crops pollinated by bees. Now, if we look again at the requirements of bees, all they need is flowers. And again, not to be sprayed with pesticides, let them live and give them flowers. The bee basically is a wasp that some 100 million years ago developed a vegetarian diet. So their wasp ancestors hunt meat or insects for meat, for protein, and to bring to their larvae. When flowers started to develop, this branch of wasp that became a bee discovered that they can eat pollen from the flowers, and which give them the fats, the protein, the minerals, vitamins that they need. And then this insect became a vegetarian bee. Now, nectar is mostly sugars with some other things in there that the bees make honey out of. It's a must, they must have it, they need energy. However, in an agricultural setting, in a managed system, that's what beekeepers all over the world do. They tend to collect the honey because we want the honey. It's a very luxurious and expensive product. And you can give the bees sugar water instead, which is a very cheap sugar. It's not the best. Very organic, ecological beekeepers will eat less sugar, but basically you can sustain bees on sugar. So the sugar is not the problem in maintaining bees. However, the pollen, and what you see here is a honeybee, it has a special structure on its hind leg in which she can collect these tiny grains of pollen, add some, regurgitate some nectarines to make it sticky, and she forms this big ball of pellets on her hind leg, which she then brings into the hive. These, what you see here is one pollen grain. It has, under a microscope, it's a tiny grain. Many plants have different grain. They look different. Their nutritional components are different. But this is what's sustaining bees. That's what they feed their larvae. That's their nutrition. As flowers disappear and as fields of wildflowers become a shopping mall or an apartment building or a highway or whatever, or even agricultural areas that are growing and growing, and much of the year they don't have food for bees, this is becoming a product that's limiting bees. And this is much more difficult to produce artificially. In fact, I was mentioning to Ben early that I have an ongoing project for a few years with Professor Jerry Wright from Oxford University, so the UK, in which we're learning about bee nutrition and we're trying to actually develop an artificial diet that could be fed to bees to replace this pollen that's disappearing. But if we look at this pyramid here, which might be not the way you tend to look at the world, here we are, humanity, with about 2/3, 3/4 of our diet dependent on bees. Bees that are fully dependent on pollen. And pollen is really these little tiny grains are worth more than gold. That's what's maintaining us. And so it's really kind of, again, a different perspective of looking at how humanity and our food safety is dependent on this little grain. And again, a lot of the studies I'll talk about today, which are more theoretical studies of how bees make decisions, accumulate into trying to produce actually this artificial pollen to feed bees. So let's go into the brain of the bee a minute and see how the kind of decisions she has to make in balancing her diet. And I'll show you here the schematic diagram. This is a paper that I wrote together with Jerry Wright that I mentioned and Sue Nicholson from Pretoria, South Africa. It's a review of the nutritional physiology and ecology of honeybees. But here you see it in a pictorial diagram. So here we look inside the hive. And a colony of bees, and these honeybees are very unusual in terms of bees in being highly social, what we call eusocial. It's not common for bees. Most bees are solitary. They don't live in groups. But honeybees live in a colony of 20, 30,000 individuals, a queen, many, many workers, and some male drone bees. And all this requires coordinating the city. Who is going to bring water? Who is going to bring nectar? Who is going to bring pollen? How much? Who is going to feed the young? Who is going to protect the colony? And many other tasks that bees have to do. In terms of nutrition, we have the foragers. So these are the older bees, older meaning that they're about 3 weeks old. Bees don't live all that long. If you collect water, and especially in hot days, water is essential. And you have to have fresh water, at least not water with pesticides, so that they can bring water back and to cool the colony. Some bees, some of the foragers go and collect nectar. The nectar they bring in they meet another bee inside, which is a younger bee that is called a storer bee. They shofalax, they go tongue by tongue, they move the nectar from one bee to the other bee. This storer bee then goes into the comb that were built by other builder bees from wax, and she regurgitates this nectar. Other young bees work this nectar, producing, ripening the honey. Other bees are foragers for pollen. And pollen, as I mentioned, can come in different shapes and colors and nutritional components. They bring it in on their hind leg, download it into other cells from which the bees produce what we call bee bread, which is pollen that's been sitting for a bit. The nurse bees feed on this pollen. They develop glands in their head, the food glands, that produce jelly. This jelly is fed to the queen. It's also fed to the larvae. So you have egg, a young larvae develop into a pupa and into adult bee. And they also feed the drone bees. They feed different jellies to larvae, to queens, to worker cells, queen cells. But all this takes a lot of coordination and decision making. And this forager that makes the decision here in the field, that can be a kilometer, 2, 3 away from the hive, when she's flying by herself in a field of flowers, deciding which flower should I go to, what pollen should I bring in, has to make a decision that's going to affect the nutrition of the whole colony, that are then indirectly fed by the nurse bees to feed the larvae. And so it's a big question of how does this, or whether this forager knows what are the needs of the colony and how are they making the decisions to balance the needs of what we call the superorganism, the colony. So we can look at the colony as a whole organism, a superorganism, with its own nutritional balances, its own decisions, not made by the queen, of course, but through the whole worker somehow decisions are made. And so I'll go now into some experiments we did into trying to look at this question of balancing nutrition. So here is the first experiment that was done by a postdoc in the lab, Harman Hendriksma, who came from Europe. And what we asked here is whether or how are bees sensitive to the stores of carbohydrates and proteins in their hive. So I'm going to talk about several macronutrients in the next few minutes. The two of the big ones are carbohydrates and proteins. And we did a study with two species of bees, the honeybee that I talked about, highly social, and the bumblebee, common in England, common in North America, common in north of Israel, but less so in the rest of the country, but also increasingly used in agriculture. And this is what we call the primitively social bee. This colony is founded by one queen by herself. Then she has a few workers. They grow to about 200 or 300 workers. Then they cooperate a bit. Then there's a conflict and the whole thing collapses. So it only lasts for a few weeks. And therefore, they do not need to produce honey because there's no colony to maintain over the winter. Unlike honeybees, where you have 20, 30,000 bees, and they live year after year in the colony, and they have to pass the whole winter with lots and lots of honey stores. So they need a lot of carbohydrates out of honey. And so this was done in the Rehovot, in our campus. On the other side of campus, we have a large agricultural farm, where also our bee lab has an area with bees and enclosures like this in which we can do these kind of experiments. So every enclosure had a colony, either honeybees and then bumblebees, and they cannot then freely fly for food around, for flowers around, so then we can control their diets. And we gave them a choice between 5 different dishes of protein-rich sources. It was flowers that are rich in protein, which is like pollen, and 5 concentrations of dishes of sugar water, different concentrations, which is rich in carbohydrates. I won't get into the details of their choices between the different concentrations, but just the main finding, and that relates to the manipulation of the colony, either the honeybee or the bumblebee, in terms of their carbohydrate reserves. So we can add honey, or we can remove honey. We add sugar water to the bumblebee, we remove it. Or we can add pollen, a comb with pollen, or remove the pollen they have. So we can manipulate their stores to see how it affects the decision-making of the foragers outside. And so I'll show you a few graphs here, but I'll go through them to show you the main points. So we see honeybees, and then we'll look at the bumblebees. What we did here is when the bees were in the enclosure with the feeders, we monitored them for several days, and we photographed the dishes every few minutes. And we could count the number of foragers that went to collect nectar and how many went to collect pollen. And so what we see here are the pollen foragers in the colony and the nectar foragers in the colony. And then we look at the manipulation. So that's what these symbols here say. And what we see for the honeybees is that the manipulation of increasing pollen stores, so this is P+, we added protein, added pollen, or removed pollen, affected very much the pollen foragers. So the main significant effect we see in honeybees is in terms of the pollen foragers, those bees collecting pollen. When there's need for pollen, we see a large number of pollen foragers. When there's no need for pollen, we see very few pollen foragers. And basically, pollen is something that's not stored for very long, unlike honey that they can produce more and more of. The bumblebees, on the other hand, if they do not produce honey, no reason to store a lot of nectar because they're not going to live for very long if they don't need to survive the winter. They're more sensitive to the carbohydrate stores. So these bees, when they're naturally not, we don't feed them extra carbohydrates, many bees go to collect nectar. They need energy to produce more and more young. But when we added C+, we added carbohydrates to the colony, now very few bees go to collect nectar. So the main sensitivity here is to nectar collecting. You can look at these data also in a little bit different way. This is in terms of the percent of bees that are foraging for nectar or for pollen. So we see that, let's start with so we have 8 colonies, about 2,000, 1,000, 2,000 bees counted. And you see that a normal balanced situation, both the honeybees and the bumblebees, about 80% of them collect nectar and about 20% collect pollen. But once we shift the honeybees to having pollen in there, then there's no more reason to store pollen. It's never stored much. So the pollen foragers went down to 3%. Everybody is going to collect nectar because honey we can make more and more and more of to be ready for the winter, 20, 30, 40 kilograms per hive. On the other hand, the bumblebees, when we add carbohydrates, they no longer collect nectar, but they're not going to make honey, but they go to collect pollen because that's food that they need to produce more and more young. So we see the differences between the different species in terms of their life history and needs. This is one more way to show it, and I want to show it because this is going to get us to another couple of experiments we'll talk about. This is looking at things in what we call the geometric approach to nutrition. This is a growing way of looking at nutrition, and it's also used to look at human nutrition and pets' diet nutrition, and we also look at it at honeybees. And what we look here is at the macronutrients themselves. So we don't look at honey and pollen, but we look at carbohydrates and protein. Basically, we know in pollen how much carbohydrates there are in, how much pollen is in there, and we can do these calculations. And when we do that in a geometric framework of axes of nutrients, again, we see that in the normal conditions, both the honeybees and the bumblebees collect about 1 part protein for 28 parts carbohydrates, or about 1 to 17 in the bumblebee, not a huge difference. But when a honeybee is supplied with pollen in the hive, Now the macronutrients coming in are 1 part protein to 2,000 parts carbohydrate. You see this huge shift. So this is a way to look at geometrically. Now I'm going to use the same geometric approach to ask a different question. This is another experiment we did in which we wanted to see whether bees not just can balance protein and carbohydrates, but now a more difficult question, can they balance essential amino acids? Now, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Protein is what you build your body from. There are non-essential amino acids, meaning that you can eat them from the diet, but you can also produce them themselves and play around with them. And there are what are called the essential amino acids, which means that you must get them from the diet. You cannot produce them themselves. Now, bees have also essential amino acids, and we surveyed many different flowers. So Harmon basically went to the local nature food store and got all these humus flower and pea flower and spell flower and all kinds of flowers. We analyzed their nutritional composition, and we ended up looking at 4 in this experiment. And what we found is 2 flowers, yellow pea and red lentil, that are rich in lysine, which is an essential amino acid, and not very rich in methionine. So you see that the axis in this geometric approach framework is leaning towards the lysine. And another 2, kamut, which is a kind of ancient grain, and spelt, which are both rich in methionine, but quite poor in lysine. Now, neither of these on their own will supply honeybees the essential amino acids, that they need. If you only eat this, you're going to be lacking methionine and you'll not be able to produce young bees. If you only eat this, you're going to be lacking lysine and not be able to produce it. We wanted to see whether bees can balance between the 2. And so what we did here is, again, in the farm, in our enclosures, we had honeybee colonies that we were placed for a week without giving them any extra pollen. And as I mentioned, they do not store pollen for long. So after a few days, a week, they're out of pollen reserve. Now they're hungry for pollen, for protein. Now they're from pollen. And then for a week, we supplied them dishes outside with 1 of the 4 flowers. In this example, it would be yellow pea. For the whole week, they eat yellow pea. Now, they're getting only this unbalanced diet. After a week, we give them now a day of choice. In the choice, they have, again, the same yellow pea, so we call it same. Maybe they love yellow pea, they got used to it, they want to keep on eating yellow pea. Or we had something that's complementary. So in this case, it would be kamut, but in other permutations, it would be the spelt. We did all the different permutations. And this basically complements their needs for this other essential amino acid. We wanted to see whether they switch. But it could be that they just switch because if they ate all week the same diet, they say, I'm sick of it, let's go for something else. So we made it more difficult for them. And we also added a similar diet, the red lentil, which is also a new diet. They haven't seen it. It's new. If they're just switching to something new, they may go to either red lentil or kamut. But red lentil won't help you because it's still deprived of methionine and rich in lysine. So it's not complementary. We wanted to see whether they can specifically bias their feeding towards the complementary. And what we did is then we offered them this what we call a cafeteria, dishes with these different diets. Here I'll show them coded. So you see yellow pea in different permutations. This is what's called the block design. So every block has all 3 dishes in a randomized fashion, so the bees can do what's where. Let me show you how the bees in a little movie, how they're moving. So so now they're offered the diets. Before they were going in there, they're smelling, tasting, collecting it into their hind legs, like they look for pollen. They're very hungry for pollen. They want to get this into the hive. And then we allow them to feed until we get to when the dishes are almost empty, and then we stop the experiment. Now, as we do this, the bees are feeding, we took photographs every few minutes of the dishes. And at the end, we also weighed them. From the photographs, we can count the number of bees on every dish in these samples. So we can actually see that this dish here had no bees on it during this photo, while this dish had many bees on it. So you can count the bees and also weigh the plates to see the decision making of the colony, the foragers at the colony level. And these are the results. So what we see is here I'm showing you the weights of how much they ate, but it was very much the same also when we counted the number of bees. And we see that the same and the similar are eaten less, statistically very significantly at the 0.001 level, very highly significant. Preference for the complementary. So they're eating a bit of everything, but biasing their food to the complementary. Now this complementary for one colony could have been spelt. For a different colony, it could have been red lentils. So it's not that you prefer one thing to the other. They're actually complementing their diets. This was one of the first really findings that surprised even us, that bees actually can do this task, to know what the colony needs, what the larvae are needing in there, and know what they're collecting. So we did another experiment to test this with real collected pollens. This was done by a master student, Sharoni Shafir. And what we did here was we collected pollens from many different plants. We assayed their macronutrients, and here we're looking at fatty acids. So not amino acids, but fatty acids. And fatty acids also, there's many non-essential fatty acids, and there are two that are essential fatty acids that we call omega-3 and omega-6. So omega-6, which is called linoleic acid, or omega-3, which is called linolenic acid. And you see that we found these 4 flowers, 2 of which, this Asteraceae and the almond, that are rich in omega-6, but poor in omega-3, and 2, this thistle and one of these Brassicaceae flowers that are very rich in omega-3, but poor in omega-6. And then we did a similar design to what you saw before, except we did it in an observation hive. An observation hive with a colony that has a glass panel so we can see what's happening inside. And I'll tell you why we want that in a minute. Again, for a week, the bees had no pollen. They're now hungry for pollen. Now for a few days, we give them only one pollen source. In this example, Asteraceae, but we did all permutations. And then on the test day, we did not give them a choice like before, but rather we only offered one plate for 5 minutes. Bees collected from it. Then we replaced it, gave another plate for another 5 minutes. Asteraceae 5 minutes, almond 5 minutes, then the Carthamus, the thistle for 5 minutes, then again 5 minutes each. And also built in a way that it's either the same deficient diet that you've had all week, or a similar one that's different, that's not really complementing you, or the nutritionally complementary one. And the assay we looked here is that we individually marked bees with tags. And then when the bee comes into the hive, as I said, it's running a city, there's communication, the bee performs a dance. Now, there's quite a few different dances. We're talking about the round dance here. And I'll show you an example in a second. And the bee dances, and it tells her sisters in the hive how excited she is about her subjective evaluation of the food source she just found. We wanted to see, and if the bee is more excited, she does a faster dance, and that recruits more bees to foragers to the place she came from. So it's a way for the foragers to communicate and tell other bees where to go find the optimal food for the colony at that time. And so here what you're seeing is the marked bees with the green and blue and other dots. I'll show you in a second the dance. But look at this bee here. See, this bee is dancing, and she's doing what's called the round dance. She's going around right, and then left, and then right, and then left. And you may see the yellow baskets on her hind leg. That's the pollen she came in from with. And the other bees, her sisters, that are in what's called the dance area. These are unemployed foragers that are looking for a place to go get food. They're reading her dance with her antennae, and they see how excited she is about what she brought. But another bee may be coming in and doing a less rigorous dance, and then they'll follow the more excited bee. And then we looked at all these movies and measured frame by frame, the rate at which the bee dances, and basically reading the language of the bee. And so this is what the bees are telling their sisters. So this is the mean dance rates in terms of turns per second when she's going for the same pollen that they've had all week, the similar one, or the complementary. And what we find is that statistically, the complementary gets a faster rates of dance than the same, meaning that the bees are subjectively evaluating it being more valuable and telling their sisters, go here. Now, this is actually very strong statistics. And if we look at the statistics, we can look at the effect of the floral source itself. So was it almond or brassica? That's statistically not significant. It's not that they prefer one thing to the other. It all depends. It's all textual. But whoever was complementary for that colony, that's the one that got the fastest dancing. Now, this small difference of about 10%, which seems kind of small to us, is actually the difference between dancing in terms of nectar, so a 30% sugar nectar or a 60% sugar nectar, which is a huge difference. And so in bee language, this is a very strong statement saying, go to the complementary diet, and they can tell what amino acid the colony is needing and send the recruits to the complementary diet. Now, the last experiment I'll show you is we asked, well, what happens if they're not able to complement their diets? And this is very much true in monoculture, in huge agricultural areas where they grow one thing. So almonds, bees in California go to almonds, alders, almonds and almonds and almonds. An almond is one of the pollens that's not rich in omega-3 and high in omega-6. What will happen to a bee that comes from a colony that ate an unbalanced diet? And specifically, we focused at looking at a diet that's lacking omega-3, or more specifically, rich in omega-6 relative to omega-3. So this is the work by a student, Yael Alian, just finished her PhD, with a colleague, Arnon Dag, from the Vulcani Center. And what we did here was we fed the bees a diet that was artificially made with soy flour, the thyme protein, a little bit of pollen to make it more tasty. But the main difference is the kind of oil we added to the diet. So one diet had corn oil, which is rich in omega-6, so corn omega-3. Another one had sesame, which is also rich in omega-6. And the omega-6 to 3 ratio are very high for these diets. The other two diets were either natural pollen that has much more omega-3 and a low ratio of omega-6 to 3. That's what bees actually like to eat. Or we added sage and flax oils, which are good, healthy omega-3 rich oils to reduce the omega-6 to 3 ratio. So two that are low in 6 to 3 ratio and two that are high. Now the bees grew and they seem to be okay. But we wanted to see what does lack of omega-3 do to the cognitive performance of the bees. Because data from mammals and humans show that a lack of omega-3, or more specifically high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in our diet, results in many health problems, especially to the mind. So attention deficit disorders, dementia, depression, these are many of these syndromes associated with lack of omega-3 or too much omega-6 to omega-3. And unfortunately, our Western modern diet is very skewed to high omega-6 relative to omega-3 relative to our ancestral diets. And so we ask the bees, how well can they learn when they're deprived of omega-3? The way we do it is in this assay that we've been doing it for many, many years, and there's many labs around the world. It's a very common assay to look at bee learning and memory, in which we control all the conditions. So honeybees are harnessed in little straws just for the time of the experiment. And bees like to be in very crowded conditions, so being harnessed actually, they're not stressed. And you can see that they're not stressed because they learn very quickly. An animal that's stressed does not learn quickly. But when we put a bee in the harness, and it came from one of the diet colonies, we then do associative conditioning, like Pavlovian conditioning. So instead of ringing the bell and giving the dog a steak that Pavlov did, what we do here is we have a computer turn on a valve that flows odor to the bee's antennae, so she smells the odor. but it's just that the floral odor that doesn't mean anything to the bee. And after a few seconds, we feed her with a drop of sugar. So now the association is formed between this odor means I get a drop of sugar. But to make it a bit more difficult on the bees, we also randomly put in trials in which there's a different odor that is associated with a drop of salt touching her antennae. So that's a negatively reinforced odor. We want to see whether the bees can tell apart the two odors and learn the odor that gave them food. So let me show you a little movie of how this works. So look, the LEDs tell you when the odor turned on. When the green turned on is when the odor turned on. The bee is now waiting there. The odor turned on. If your antennae are now pointing, she's smelling the odor. The red tells us to give her a drop of sugar. This is a needle with a little tiny drop of sugar water. You touch her antennae. The antennae has many sensors on it. She senses the sugar, sticks out her tongue, and she eats the drop. And then another bee comes in. We'll do a lineup of many bees. I'll show you one more time quickly. She's waiting. Odor turned on. She's smelling, but it doesn't mean anything. Her tongue is not out. Now, she's only when you touch the sugar, now the tongue is out and she's eating the drop of sugar. Now let's go to a later trial, and this may be as little as 1 or 2 trials later. And look quickly, it's going to happen quickly. When the green turns on, the odor turns on, and look at the bee's tongue. She's waiting, odor on, you see the tongue is out? She's there waiting for odor. Give me food, give me food. And now she gets the food. This is very quick Pavlovian conditioning. So let's look at how the performance of the different group of bees. So these are classical learning curves. You see 6 trials with the positive odor and 6 with the negative odor. The negative associated odor, all of them do not stick out their tongue to, they know salt is no good. But the odor associated with the sugar reward, we'll look at trial 1, the very beginning. You see the percent of bees that respond with proboscis extension, proboscis is their tongue, is close to 0. So just an odor doesn't mean anything, it's a neutral odor, they're not responding. But 1 try later, so it's only about 10 minutes later, after 1 try learning, you see that the learning goes up to almost 60% of bees already stick out their tongue, having learned that. 2 trials later, it goes up to 80%, 90 and almost 100%. This is true for bees that came from the low omega-6, high omega-3 diets. They're good learners. The other bees from colonies that received the same diet, but was a high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, you give them, they eat the sugar, they smell the odor, but very low response. They're not learning after 6 trials. And so this was really the first time ever that the effect of omega-3 on any invertebrate learning was found. And this was really very exciting for not just understanding bees, but really understanding the effect of omega-3 and omega-6 in diets in general. And maybe in the question and answer, we can get into the ecological meaning of that. So given about half an hour or some, so I think I'll end here, just to thank, of course, the different funds over the years, including my project with the BBSRC from the UK, in which we're actually producing this artificial diet. The office stays the same, the lab is always here. My technician, Chaim Kalev, has been with me for many, many years and has helped with all these experiments. I mentioned students along the way. Students are changing all the time. So this is some of the students I mentioned in the work. This is more recent in COVID-19 days. Good students come and go, but the bees are here and the research continues. And I just want to wish you a sweet and well-balanced Happy New Year.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture. So we can now open the question and answer session. You can raise your hand or you can write your question in the chat. And here, Mr. Levine, he's asking, what a wonderful presentation. Sorry, he's just thanking you for the presentation. And there was a question few minutes before is how pollination happen in hothouses without bees.
Of course, it depends what is grown in the hothouse. For example, tomatoes used to be grown outside. These days are grown in enclosures to fight many of the pests that were insects that were aphids and so forth that were a problem. And in outside, actually, tomatoes were wind pollinated. So the wind did the work, and it can self-pollinate itself, and you don't need bees. But once they're brought inside, now there's no wind. So initially, what they did is they had people walk around with buzzers to buzz every flower individually to shake it so that the pollen comes in. That's of course very expensive. 20 years ago, maybe more now, already in the 90s, bumblebees were developed in Europe mostly commercially to be placed in these greenhouses. And bumblebees do what is called buzz pollination. So they go to the tomato flower, hang on it, shake it so that they can get the pollen, and they're doing pollination. And so that's what's used there. If you don't have the bees, then you either do a hand pollination, or you can put wind tunnels that create wind, but often it's not as optimal as having bees. So it really depends on the crop. Some crops can self-pollinate. Sometimes it depends on the temperature and cold weather or warm weather. They have more or less self-pollination. So it really depends on the crop, the climate, and how much you need bees or not.
Thank you. And Mr. Levine is asking also, how do the bees carry water to their hive?
Exactly. So basically bees have two ways, or honeybees have two ways to carry anything. Either they suck it up with their tongue, and then it's in their, what is called the crop. The crop is like a balloon. It's the very first part of their digestive system. But it's also called the public stomach. So it's almost like you would keep something in your mouth when you come home. It's before it goes into your real stomach. And that's used both to collect nectar. So bee sucks up nectar and she can load up the crop. It's a big balloon and it can get to about half, 50% of the weight of the bee can be in that balloon. About 50 milligrams out of the 100 milligrams total weight of the bee. And that's the way they bring nectar, and then they regurgitate it. And it's also the way they bring water. So they suck up the water and then they regurgitate it. The other place they have for storage is what I mentioned, the hind leg, the pollen basket, where they stick pollen grain to put that in. But water can be very, very important for bees. And if you look at the decision making in a very hot day, they don't care about pollen or nectar, they need water, because they maintain a steady thermoregulation, steady temperature in the hive of 35 degrees Celsius. And it can be minus 20 degrees outside, and it's going to be 35 degrees Celsius in the middle of the colony where the brood is. It has to have incubated very strictly. Or it can be 40 degrees outside, and then cool it down to 35 inside. And cooling down is done with water. So basically the cooling down system of the bees is that they first turn on the fan. When it just gets a bit hot, bees line up in the line from the outside towards the inside, and they're fanning. And it creates a ventilation and cooling down the hive. If it's too hot, you want to turn on the AC. The AC is used by evaporating water. So then the bees stay there, but then they stick out some water on their tongue. That water evaporates and you lose heat that way. And for that, they need water. So when it gets very hot, they must have water. They bring it in, cool down like that. There's very little bit of water storage in the hive, but there might be some.
Thank you. And our dear friend Nigel, he's the director of our office in London. He's asking which are the magical benefits of Manuka honey, particularly from New Zealand. Is it smart marketing or reality?
Hello, Nigel. Again, I'm not an expert on health benefits. You should ask doctors. Something was just recently. So the one thing that I think is well established is that honey is the best cough medicine for some kind of cough. That's generally honey. It has many antioxidants, antiviral properties, antifungal properties. And there's been studies in Israel and the rest of the world. I think there was a recent one at Oxford that I just heard about, where you give parents or the children that are coughing at night, and they get different on the bench pharmaceutical pharmacy medicine or a spoon of honey. The reporting is that the honey works best to suppress cough. So this is generally for honey. In terms of manuka in composition has more antioxidants, has all kind of properties, and therefore it's claimed to be better. Again, I'm not familiar with the medical literature. Definitely, there's also marketing involved. It's unique to New Zealand, even though there's also different manuka species in Australia. And so the Australian beekeepers are trying to now also use some marketing to say, we also have manuka-like honey in Australia, so it's not just New Zealand. So there's definitely marketing. It's definitely a good honey. How many of the medical claims are true or not, I cannot say.
And thank you. Sarah Siegel, she asks, does more omega-6 make human worse at learning?
So the quick answer is yes. The more long answer is, nutrition is very complicated. So the Faculty of Agriculture have a whole school of nutrition. There's many studies on nutrition. There's many opinions. Some people say eat only meat. Some people say only vegan, only carbs, no carbs, med diets, and of course, long studies, many things. But it's also the omega-3, omega-6 issue is also debatable to some degree by doctors and nutritionists. However, there are studies and there is pretty good support for the fact that omega-3 is good for cognition, and lack of omega-3 is a problem. And again, as humans, based on rats and mice studies, and our recent work with honeybees, so after the data I showed you before, we did a more recent experiment in which we controlled more carefully the omega-6-3 ratio. So not just whether there's more omega-3 or less, but we had 12 different diets, so they could have the same amount of omega-3, but varying the ratio. What we found is that the ratio is more important than the absolute amount, and that's consistent with many of the thoughts also in human nutrition. So in a way, it strengthens that opinion that having too much omega-6 is bad. And I mentioned our ancestral, or not that long ago, or even a few hundred years ago, diet was about 1-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3. And today's modern Western diet is about 15-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3. We're eating less omega-3 because we eat less fish and less omega-3 rich diet. And even if you eat, for example, eggs from a chicken that's free-ranging and eating grass, that egg is going to have more omega-3 than a chicken that comes from very intense commercial setting where they're eating corn and grain and so forth. And even the cow that you may eat that's free grazing is going to have more omega-3 than one that's raised on corn or other cereals and so forth. So it's affecting a lot of our food chain. A lot of the processed foods, rich with corn oil and processed foods, have a lot of omega-6. And that's what's causing this bias in the Western diet. And some doctors, and there's full books and conferences on it, believe that this is really one of the biggest problems for human nutrition and health, is the lack of omega-3 in our diets and too much omega-6. There's some studies, for example, look at, and it's true for pregnant women and their babies, it's true for adolescents, it's true for the elderly. There's many studies in different groups. There's some group that's related to your question with learning, looking at spatial learning, where a group of elderly people were looking at their diet, more omega-6 and more omega-3, and we're giving spatial tasks, like computer game, we have to orient and find yourself. And they found that the high omega-6 impaired the spatial cognition.
Thank you. So we have time for a few more questions. There is a question that I think many of us are asking ourselves: how can we attract more bees to our gardens or balconies?
Excellent. So yeah, bees are great in the garden. Again, if you're allergic to a bee, then of course you have to be careful. Some people are allergic. Uh, Otherwise, though, the chance that the bee will sting you is very low. They only sting when they're protecting their hive, because they work so hard to collect this honey that they have to defend it. So if you come to steal their honey, they'll try to sting you. But when the bee is foraging outside, coming to your garden, all she cares about is flowers, and to maximize and optimize their time. They're very quick. They're measuring exactly the time, the distance. We have many studies on the economics of their decision making. They're very good economists. So really don't want to waste time trying to run after you. They want to go find the flowers, come home, tell the others, do the right decisions to get as much honey and pollen, nectar and pollen as they can. So even if you want to do it even as a hobby, you know, I pet bees and I show bees. So if you see a bee on the flower and she's all in there collecting nectar, if you approach slowly and you can even pet her back, their hairy back, she won't mind it. If you do it slowly, you know, but really they're very gentle when they're on flowers. And how to attract them to flowers? You have to have the right flowers. And there's a growing knowledge and also understanding that we need to have flowers good for bees. So for example, a lawn that's all grass is not good for bees. When it's flowers, they'll come to collect the pollen from the flower. But if you mow it all the time, it's a desert for bees. And there's an acknowledgement of having more ecological gardening, less grass lawns that eat a lot of water and give nothing back, and more wildflowers that are good, not just for bees, but also for other pollinators, for butterflies, for the many wild bees. So again, in Israel, we have over 1,200 species of wild bees. In the UK, there's a few hundred species. In the whole world, about 25,000 species. All of these need nectar and pollen. So what you need is what we call nectarivorous plants. Actually, they're nectar and pollen, but they're called nectarivorous plants. And for example, it's region-based, so you have to see in your region. But there's many, like the Xerces Society in the US, which is for conservation of insects. There's groups in the UK, there's groups in Australia. In Israel, there's a plant list of bee-friendly plants. So if you look today, many more enlightened nurseries will actually sell seeds of bee-friendly plants. You can find listings of bee-friendly plants in your area. And basically what you need is to plant plants that produce flowers and flowers that have nectar and pollen, because some flowers do not. Some ornamental, very nice looking flowers may actually give nothing to the bees. So it's like a desert. And so that's the main thing for honeybees. If you also want to attract wild bees, then they need not only the food sources, but also the nesting sources. And so in wild bees, many of them nest in the ground, and some wild bees nest in wood stems or other holes, like a carpenter bee makes a hole in wood. And so you can either make yourself or purchase what are called bee hotels. So they're like either bamboo sticks of different sizes or wood with holes drilled in different sizes in which bees can nest. And so basically to make a bee-friendly garden, both for honeybees and also for the wild bees, have nesting areas, either some just sandy patch could be good for them. And you can look up at what's, again, for your area, what direction it could be south facing or north facing, and not too wet, whatever, would be good for ground dwelling bees. A bee hotel for the cavity nesting bees, and the right plants that will flower for long enough periods and produce nectar and pollen.
Thank you. And I think our last question is from Harvey Glasner. What is your opinion regarding the proliferation of honey from China? Is it poor quality honey? Is it watered down honey, like with sugar?
I think it's a huge generalization. I mean, China is huge, produces lots of honey. Basically, there's more. Well, again, depends on the country whether there's imports or not. In Israel, we try to have our own honey, but we don't have enough honey for the growing demand of the population. We have to import honey. But every import passes through testing, both for pesticides, because if it comes from an area where there's lots of pesticides, it's going to get into the nectar, into the honey, and for adulteration, that it's not just sugar water mixed into something. And so there's labs in the US and Germany and Israel where these tests are done. And if they find either some pesticide or some kind of chemical that shouldn't be there, then the whole shipment is banned, it goes back, or it's adulterated. So it's true that there are cases where such shipments from China have been found to be not up to standard and brought back, but it's probably not true that all shipments from China. So it really depends from where and what, but like anything else, it's the best if you buy honey from your local beekeeper, somebody you know, you can trust, that you can see is actually real fresh, good honey. Like any kind of food. If you buy it local and fresh and you know who made it, usually it's going to be a higher chance of being better than something that's mass-produced somewhere and brought in and you don't know what's in there.
Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you everybody to joining us. I would like to wish all of you a happy Shana Tova, happy New Year, hopefully with more health and a better year than what we had now. And thank you, Professor Shafir. It was a great lecture for all the information. I will send to all of you the recording tomorrow. And Happy New Year again.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
Later out.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben, to you too.
Thank you.